Welcome back. You're watching our CNBC TV 18 special coverage on the road to GST, which is looking very bumpy now. But Mr. Kanabar, coming back to you, the next meeting of the GST Council is on the 16th of January. The government was still hoping that perhaps in the budget session itself we could have seen the bills being taken up by Parliament, but we don't know if that's going to finally be the case. So let me then ask you, in terms of business continuity, what should India Inc. do today? And also in terms of budget expectations, how do we plan and what should we be ready for?
So two parts to that, One is the government framework and the other is the ability on the part of industry to implement. So we are looking at changes to IT systems, we are looking at sort of multi-locational compliance, all of which needs really a clarity, not merely legislation, but a time frame between the legislation and the ultimate rollout date. And I would like to believe that an industry would need at least 3 to 4 months post everything being in place for a rollout to happen. That's just a normal minimal requirement for industry. So a 4-month window is something which is essential from the industry perspective. From the legislation perspective, assuming that clarity is achieved, consensus is achieved on dual control, I think really on a going forward basis, come 1st February and the budget being rolled out, really there will be more work towards GST and the rates converging towards GST. The government will have to ensure that we are going down that very same path so that when GST comes, the bumps are de minimis. I think both of those things are very, very essential, Shereen.
Let me take the same point across to Sachin Menon as well. Sachin, both Money, Mr. Kanabar are talking about how the budget will perhaps still, irrespective of what happens with the GST in this session, the budget will still try and align itself to the eventual GST rate structure, even though we still don't have clarity on the eventual rate classification. What would your key expectations now be from Finance Minister Jaitley and Budget 2017, given the GST context?
Well, I think this budget period is something which is very unique, in the sense that neither the finance minister nor the industry know that when is GST going to be rolled out. So there is a difficult task on hand as far as the finance minister is concerned to present his budget, because the budget estimation is based on which law, what rate. If the GST comes in the midway, somewhere in June or later, how is it going to be estimated, that what is going to the budget estimate and how the expenditure which is going to be projected? There is going to be a big challenge as far as the government is concerned. So at the best, this budget could be a, to some extent could be a guesstimate rather than estimate, because it's all depend upon when is GST going to be implemented. And despite all this, as usual, every industry associations, etc., have made the representations with whatever their wish list, etc. So I think this is going to be a very, very fluid budget session, which is going to be witnessed by us shortly.
It is certainly going to be a very fluid budget session, and you were talking about the lack of clarity on GST. There's also a lack of clarity on how demonetization is going to impact the economy. And I don't envy the job of the team at North Block, but Money, what's your own sense of the demonetization impact? Because that clearly has now become one of the big talking points, even within the pre-budget meetings of state finance ministers led by the likes of Amit Mitra, etc. What is your own sense? And let me put that question to each of you on the panel, and I'll start by asking you, Money, on the impact of demonetization on the economy.
Look, the way I look at it is the demonetization impact is more political and less economic as far as GST is concerned. Because look, what demonetization has done is to make businesses much more organized and much more process driven. And that is precisely what GST also does. So the overall share of organized businesses and large businesses and process driven businesses would be more in a demonetized situation. So would be the case in GST. GST is also a game changer in the sense that businesses which are not very well organized would have to make themselves organized. So I would say that if you look at it from an economic impact perspective or from a business perspective, and I have a business which has undergone the difficulties of demonetization, that would typically mean that I've already started organizing myself. And because I've started organizing myself, I can do better when GST comes along. You know, I'll be 50% organized and the remaining 50% GST will compel me to do. So I look at both of these as driving business in the same direction rather than in opposite directions. But as far as the political equations are concerned, I mean, you never know.
That's right, but you know, some would argue that what was the need of demonetization, because GST perhaps would have achieved several of the objectives that the government is hoping that demonetization will achieve. But Hari, you know, when you speak with businesses, when you speak with your clients, what is the sense that you get now in terms of how long this is likely to play out, how long we are likely to see a demand compression? What is your own sense and the impact as far as indirect taxes are concerned, tax collections are concerned?
So Shereen, actually on the demonetization, the jury is not out, you know, and if you talk to different sectors are reacting differently, you know, but in my sense, you can't dispute the fact that the impact will be there at least for a couple of quarters, you know, and maybe if it's longer, we really have to wait and watch. So to that extent, the government is going to factor in the potential downside on indirect taxes by virtue of compression of demand, you know, which is expected to be at least 2 quarters. You know. But having said that, there is also going to be some upside on the direct tax collections on all the declarations that have happened. So the numbers, nobody knows. So it's going to be one of those very peculiar budgets where I agree with what Sachin said. There is going to be a huge guess estimate that you have to do. You know. And in this whole context, Shereen, now the question is, will they start rationalizing and aligning service tax rates or any other rates under excise and customs or other excise and service tax to the so-called GST rates? I'm not sure, you know, because the fundamental fact is there is a demand compression, there is less spending by people. So it's a very difficult decision for the finance minister and the North Bloc to really decide, you know, because you really want to spur the economy back. You are going to expect stimulus. I mean, I'm seeing all your ads on the Modi stimulus subject, you know, and there has got to be some stimulus both on a personal side, consumption side, and also on an infrastructure side, because government is the only one who's going to be spending. I don't think private spending is coming on. You know. So it's going to be a very, very tough budget with demonetization. You know. So GST is a separate subject, but demonetization by itself will have so many factors that will play out. You know.
Pratik, how do you see this playing out? And as Hari was pointing out, the government has a tough balancing act before it. On one side, it needs to spur consumption as well as investment. On the other hand, it may try and make the attempt to try and cushion the impact of the eventual GST rollout, starting perhaps in this budget. Do you see an increase, for instance, in service tax?
Yes, so I think on the issue of demonetization, I think by next year, when we're talking about budget for April 17 to March 18, hopefully by that time the impact would largely be neutralized because there will be enough cash in the market. What would happen for this year, which is 16-17? There really, depending on how much income tax collections, etc. you have, you might see a wider fiscal deficit, and that would be a challenge. And the good part of that is that banks are flush with funds, and therefore for governments to have more borrowing will not be that difficult. But I think demonetization, again, to reiterate the point, it's more political than related to GST. Now coming to the increase in service tax rate, I think there is a strong probability to my mind that 15% would go at least to 16, if not more. And the other concern I have is that, as you mentioned, that because the state governments are saying that cess that will be levied to compensate should only be limited to few items, and which is a right proposition to my mind, they will try and garner more revenue. So if they try and increase the tax rates to garner more revenue, then where is the stimulus that we are talking about? I mean, you need to have, you need to spur the demand by lowering the tax rate, and that's a fine balance that they need to achieve. But service tax rate, to my mind, very, very high probability of it getting increased.
Okay, so you believe at least a 1% hike in service tax rate is on the anvil in this budget, but the government is going to have to walk a very, very tight rope, because they do need to spur consumption and investment, and at the same time to balance their books as well. Gentlemen, another quick break. We're right back with you.